joining us from Australia, New Zealand, from Canada, from the UK, from the US, from South Africa as well, I think. So, and I'm sure I've missed some other countries as well. So hello from Ireland. There's a lot of us in Ireland on the call as well. And welcome to you all. So the webinar today is on past lives, exploring histories of the family. My name is Rachel Murphy, and I'm based in the Department of History at the University of Limerick. And I lecture there on the MA History of Family. And I'm delighted to be joined today by three graduates of the course. We have Cathy Roughan, Sharon Dilger, and Carmel McEvey. So welcome to you three as well. So I'm just going to start sharing my slides. I'll just do that now. So hopefully everyone can see that. Shout out if you can't. And this is the format for today. So I'm going to start off with a short discussion of what the history of family is, and then I'm going to hand over to each of our presenters, and they will share aspects of their research with you, as well as their experiences of the course at Limerick, because I know quite a number of you have expressed an interest in the course itself. And what I'm going to do is suggest that we leave the questions to the end of the session, and hopefully there'll be lots of them. We're very happy to answer any questions that you might have. So to kick off, what is the history of family? Well, in academic terms, it's a relatively recent field of study. The 1960s saw the new social history emerging in the Anglo-American world, and this emphasised the importance of studying all society, so not just the rich and famous, or in some cases the infamous. So some historians started to take what we call a history from below approach. So that's researching history from the perspective of the ordinary people, so rather than those who govern them, which had been the case beforehand. So essentially what they did is they started writing back into history those who had been previously marginalised and excluded from traditional historical accounts. So people like the poor, women and ethnic minorities. They also started considering new ways of looking at past societies. And one way of examining societies in the past was to study the family as a unit. And this is the core of what we as historians of the family do. So the history of family falls within social history, but as I'll discuss in a minute, it also draws on the more established fields of demography and economic history. So why do history of family? Well, conducting research through the prism of the family provides a much more nuanced understanding of how people lived in the past. So the kinds of topics that historians of the family research include things like household composition, life cycles, life events, how family members related to each other, so those relationships, and also how they related to the communities that they lived in. So I want to take a quick step back for a minute to think about what we mean by the family, because family itself can actually be quite difficult to define. Most people have an image in their head when they think of family, but one person's concept of family might be very different from another's. And that's because the idea of what constitutes a family is socially constructed. And by that, what I mean is that what we understand about family is based on assumptions that we share as a society that we live in. The notion of family isn't a static thing, so concepts of family can vary by geography and also by time period. So if we look at early modern Ireland, you had the kinship group headed by a patriarch, and that played a really important role in family life. Whereas as you go on later in time, the nuclear family, so that's a core family of parents and children, that tended to dominate more. Another consideration is that over the course of a lifetime, an individual might have more than one family. Sociologists refer to the family of orientation, so that's the family that a person is born into, and also the family of procreation, that's the family they become part of when they marry. So as you can see, family itself is a complex concept, and in any study we have to be very clear about which definition we're using. Sometimes historians of family examine entire populations using large data sets of information, and this information is retrieved from records such as censuses, civil records or migration data, which many of you will be familiar with and will have worked with extensively. We also use quantitative research techniques derived from historical demography and analyse trends in topics such as migration or fertility decline. But then to illustrate our findings, we often draw on genealogical research skills. And I know, again, a lot of people in the audience have that genealogical background. So you're really well served for then broadening out your knowledge into this wider sort of history of family study. Really good grounding if you have genealogy research skills. So in my current research project that I'm working on, I'm using the 1901 and 1911 censuses of Ireland, which are available online, along with civil and parish records to reconstruct case studies of individual families that were living in the north side of County Dublin, or north side of the city of Dublin, I should say. So I just wanted to give you a few examples of some of the approaches that historians of family take when we're doing our research. One aspect that we look at is household composition, and Kathy took this approach in her research, so you'll hear a bit more about that in a minute. If you select a street or a townland from the 1901 census or the 1911 census and look at the structure of the various households within it, you're likely to see quite a lot of variation. There might be a married couple with or without children, a single parent family, a household with foster children or stepchildren, for instance. Some houses will have people living alone and others will be living with siblings or relatives. And occasionally you might find 3 generations living together, which is what we describe as a STEM family. Others might be sharing a building. So in tenements, for instance, you will find lots of families sharing one building. So analysing these groupings really helps us to understand more about how past families lived and the roles that families played. Other approaches include economic history. So historians of the family will also look at the family as an economic unit. So if you think about your own family, many of the decisions that are made are based on financial factors. So things like who stays at home and inherits the family farm, who emigrates, whether to leave home or whether to continue at school or college, what kind of work you might do. So all those kind of studies come under the general category of household economics. And then a third approach that we take, we describe it sometimes as the sentiments approach, but what it's really looking at is understanding relationships within families and between families. The previous examples I've mentioned, rely on quantitative sources, but when we're looking at family relationships, we tend to look at non-numeric sources or qualitative sources. So things like letters and diaries and memoirs. And these can be analysed thematically. And that's what Carmel did in her research that she'll be discussing later. So this kind of research gives us a lot of interesting insights into familial relationships, emotional responses, and the social conventions of the period. So social historians, including historians of the family, often conduct research through different lenses, such as gender or class. We consider the historical expectations of people based on their gender. So for instance, this notion that a woman's place is in the home while her husband is the breadwinner who goes out to work, it's a Victorian middle class ideal. Pre-industrialization, many families were productive units based around the home. And if you take a pre-famine Ulster weaving family as an example, the women would be spinning, the men would be weaving, and the children would be expected to assist in various ways. So that's known as the breadwinner model, where the husband goes out to work and the wife stays at home. And this also plays into ideas of class too. So in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, middle class women were not expected to work. They often employed servants. But many working class women had no choice. The pin money that farm women received for selling butter and eggs, that often contributed significantly to the household economy, as did the wages that women in industrial areas brought in from steady employment in factories. So these are some of the things that we look at through the lenses of gender and class. And Sharon's study of Earl Grey Orphans examines gender and class to a certain extent, as does Carmel's research into Isabella Quin. So just briefly, I wanted to mention the course because, I know, like I said, some of you are interested in what is involved. The 3 talks today from Kathy, Sharon and Carmel will be discussing the research they conducted as part of the MA in the History of Family here at Limerick. The course is unique both in terms of the field of study, but also because it's been conducted in both an online and a blended format since 2006. So in any one year, we have students from Ireland who enjoy working with classmates from other European countries and people based from further afield. Australia, this year, you know, we have Australian students, we have people from New Zealand, sometimes America, Canada, South Africa. Particularly areas of the diaspora, you know, because people that have this Irish family background in particular, but not necessarily. So a lot of our students will come straight to the Masters after having spent some time either doing historical research as a special interest. So, you know, you don't necessarily have to have a background in history. You don't have to have a history degree. A lot of people have spent a lot of time doing a lot of maybe genealogical or historical family research, or have worked in allied sectors. Other people decide to go back to college and maybe do a certificate of history of family with us through our Irish Ancestry Research Centre. And then after doing that, they go on to complete the Masters. We have people with all different backgrounds. Some have done degrees in mathematics and then decide that they enjoy history, so want to come and do this course. It's a 1-year full-time or 2-year part-time course, and students conduct modules in history of family, so an introduction to the history of family, Irish cultural history, families and communities, migration, and then dissertation writing. And the dissertation can be on any topic that relates to history of family. I'm always particularly amazed at the variety of fascinating topics that students select. And so without further ado, what I want to do is actually hand over to our graduates. Our 3 speakers today are, as I said, graduates of the course, and they mainly conducted the course in an online format. Cathy and Carmel are based in Australia. They're based in Sydney and Melbourne, and Sharon lives in County Clare in Ireland. And you can see from the map, these are I've put on here the places that they're going to be, that they've looked at in their research, just so you can see where they are in case you're not familiar. The presentations are very much based around Munster, which is where Limerick is. And Cathy's research focuses on Clarecastle in County Clare. Sharon looks at the Orphans of Kilrush, also in County Clare. And Carmel will introduce you to Isabella Quin, who is from Nenagh in County Tipperary. And each of them are going to present in turn. So first of all, I would like to introduce to you Cathy Roughan, who is going to introduce you to her research on Clarecastle 1901 and 1911. Cathy lives in Sydney, but she's a native of Clarecastle, County Clare, and her family has strong links to the parish. She attended Clarecastle Girls' National School and later Colossus in Ennis before going to England to train as a registered nurse. She later travelled to Australia on a working holiday visa and liked it there so much that she migrated to Sydney in 1986, where she lives and works in her own health planning consultancy. So at school, Cathy had a great interest in local and family history, much of it passed on from her father. And during frequent trips home to Clarecastle, she renewed her interest in local and family history. And in 2018, she enrolled as a student in the MA History of Family. So I'm going to actually hand over there because I think there's some other work that Cathy has done since doing her Masters, which she might allude to at the end of her presentation. But I'm just going to hand over to you now, Cathy. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning to all of you in Ireland, and hello from Sydney to everybody in the audience. I've noticed a few familiar names in the list, and a shout out particularly to Maureen and Christy and Eric. My subject for the dissertation was Clarecastle 1901 to 1911. Clarecastle, as you saw on the map, it was in 1901 to 1911 a small fishing and port. It was considered the port of Ennis, south of Ennis, about 2 miles south of Ennis. This photograph on the front is from the Lawrence collection in the National Library of Ireland, and it shows a boat pulled up at the quay in Clarecastle and being offloaded. And it's a well-known photograph in Clarecastle. So, and in the background you can see that on the sort of left of the picture you can see the old Semple Bridge that was part of the main road between Ennis and Limerick, which of course has since been bypassed by the motorway. And then towards the centre of the picture is the old Clarecastle, which was the old army barracks. by 1901 had ceased to be an army barracks. So that just to paint a picture of the place that I was born and grew up. Next slide, please. So why the MA History of Family at UL? And these are the reasons why I chose to do the course. It was completed online. I was able to participate in some classes and discussions despite the time difference. I was able to complete the course despite no tertiary studies in history, although I have studied other tertiary courses. I've had a very long-held interest, as Rachel mentioned, in the family history of my home place, and I was able to complete the course, including the dissertation, without coming to Ireland, although I actually did come over to do the dissertation, but the format was such that I could complete it all in Australia if necessary at the time. Next slide, please. Deciding on the topic, well, I had always thought I would do something on Clarecastle. We began discussions in class quite early on, about week 5 in the first semester, about our topic. And I gradually bedded down, if you like, the research question with Ciara Branham, my supervisor, in early January. And then we decided on the census as the basis, the 2 censuses and a comparison. And we used Timothy Canaan's book as a basis for comparison. Timothy Canaan is the author of The Vanishing Irish. I'll talk some more about that in the next slide. So next slide, please. And how does my dissertation relate to the history of family? As Rachel mentioned, it examines family formation and socioeconomic conditions. I focused on historical demography and household economics because they were the areas of interest to me. We drew on the history of family literature, and 2 major references that I used were Michael Anderson's approaches to the history of the Western family, 1500 to 1914, and also, as I mentioned, Timothy Canaan's The Vanishing Irish, Households, Migration and Rural Economy in Ireland, 1850 to 1914. And Timothy Canaan uses the censuses, particularly both 1901 and 1911 census. And one of the areas that he did a rural comparison with, that I then compared Clarecastle with, was Ennistimon, which is the town of Ennistimon and some of the surrounding townlands. In my case, I just used the village. I didn't use the surrounding townlands, or what we call the Clare Abbey electoral district, which takes up most of the townlands that form the parish of Clare Abbey, which Clarecastle is part. My research then was underpinned by skills developed in the core history of family modules. In other words, the subjects that we did in the first and second semester. It was like a sort of, you were learning as you go, and you were picking up new skills and new information all the way through. And then when it's like knitting, and then you bring the blanket together at the end. So that's a good analogy, I find, for it. Next slide, please. Okay, so the results from my dissertation, and there's a couple of slides here. Clarecastle is located, as I said, in mid-county Clare, and it had a population of 567, living in 140 households in 1901. The household types found in Clarecastle in 1901 and 1911 varied from the results of Timothy Canaan's study. Timothy Canaan focused more on rural areas, sometimes with a town or a village attached. But what we found in Clarecastle is that we had a lot more either people living alone or people in family setups, which he called no family. It might be 2 siblings living together or friends living together, or extended families. And he had a variety of types of extended family, but essentially Clarecastle was dominated by what we call the nuclear simple family. And that was because it was a village and it had a variety of occupations. We had a small but significant fishing industry, and of course the role of the port. And there were an awful lot of people who identified themselves as labourers, be they agricultural labourers or labourers working in the docks, or carters, which are people that were employed to offload the ships and bring the goods mainly to Ennis or to the local coal wholesalers that were in the village at the time. Clarecastle's population was mobile. In other words, there were less than 50% of the people who were present in 1901. Sorry, 55% of those present in 1901 were absent. In other words, 45% were present. About 50 of those died, and there was obviously births. But people in occupations such as school teachers, police, ordnance survey, etc., they had moved on. So there were lots of new people coming, and obviously those who married, etc. And next slide, please, Rachel. Just next slide. Yeah, the other results. As part of my research as well, we then took the information from the demographic, the broader survey, and we looked at a random selection of 15 families with 71 individuals, and they were chosen using the house numbers from the 1901 census, so house number 7, 17, etc. And chapter 3 looked at case studies of families and individuals that had an interest that followed some of the themes that we had already alluded to in chapters 1 and 2. The random samples reflected national social issues of the period. Migration, as I've mentioned, deaths from tuberculosis featured very highly, and featured very highly across people from, if I can use the phrase, all classes in the village. I was amazed myself at who died from TB, and people that some families that surprised me. And then also very high maternal and infant mortality in the village. It wasn't as high as mortality in places like Dublin at the time, but it was still relatively high. About 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 children didn't see their first birthdays, and there were a lot of young. I think from memory, about 50 deaths of people in the 20 to 30 age group. I was looking for them in migration records, and the next thing they'd appear in death records. And so yeah, there was a very high level, a lot of mothers dying of TB, leaving young families as well. So yes, it reflected the social period. Next slide, please, Rachel. Yeah, this is the final slide. I appreciate this is hard to see, but this is an example of some of the data that I put together, and this is a selection of the first page of my what I call my random families. And what I've done here is I've presented data from the Griffith Valuation revision books, civil and parish records, newspapers, contemporary maps and photographs, migration, occupations, and lots of other information. And what I've done is, well, for example, I'll just highlight here, I know it's very small, house number 7 were a brother and sister who at the time ran the post office. In the information over here, I've looked at where I could find their births, deaths and marriages. The sister emigrated, Agnes immigrated to America. They were the Smith brother and sister. They were an old Clarecastle family. Their maternal grandfather had been, Mr. Hennessy, had been involved with the development of the port in Clarecastle back in the 1840s and 50s. Their father, George Smith, had been a member of the Papal Army in 1861 in Rome, and George continued to live and died a bachelor in Clarecastle in 1939. They were linked to many things. As I said, they were linked to the post office at the time. That later changed. He was also the poor law officer, and they were the family that had control of the tolls of what we called the Fair of Clare, which was a twice yearly fair that was held in Clarecastle to the 1960s. I remember the last one. So in the information, I've joined whatever I could find about each person there, you know, whether they emigrated, whether I could find that information. In this column here is where their house was in relation to the Griffith or Primary Valuation of Ireland and the revision books. And that was my most recent work has been in transcribing the revision books for a project which is now called Who's Been Living in My House, and that's up on the Clarecastle website. So thank you.
Hi there. Hopefully you can hear me there. Thank you very much, Kathy, for the for your presentation. Sorry, I'm just trying to. Yep, you should be able to hear me there. Thank you, Kathy, for your presentation. And I think, as everyone can see, there's an enormous amount of work that has gone into that. That's just a subsection of the amount of analysis that Kathy did. I should also say, because Kathy didn't have time to mention this, and you might want to ask her about it in the questions afterwards, that since completing the Masters, Kathy has built on this work and gone on to do a project called Who's Been Living in My House, 1855 to 1970. And I'm sure, you know, again, if anyone has any questions about this research or about that project that she's been working on subsequently, she'd be more than happy to take those afterwards. But without further ado, in the interest of time, we're going to move over now to our next presenter, who is Sharon Dilger, and she's going to be presenting her research on the Earl Grey Orphans of Kilrush. So welcome, Sharon. Sharon completed her undergraduate degree in Mary Immaculate College of Education in 1982, where she was awarded the Vere Foster Medal. And she began her teaching career in Ennis, County Clare in 1982. She worked as a volunteer with Concern in Sudan from 1985 to 1987 and returned to Clare to resume her teaching position. And she then spent 24 years as a principal before retiring in January 2021. During her teaching career, Sharon completed postgraduate studies in University of Limerick and also at Mary Immaculate College. So in 2019, she joined us to undertake the Masters of the History of Family here at Limerick. And while education has been her passion for all her life, she says that she's rediscovered her enthusiasm and her love for history. And she's planning on continuing the research that she started in her dissertation, which is on the Earl Grey Orphans of the Kilrush Workhouse. So I'll just share my slides there. I think I'm actually sharing my screen already, aren't I? I'll just share your slides there, Kathy. Sorry, Sharon. Thank you.
Good morning from Spansel Hill to those of you north of the equator and to those down under. Good evening, and a very special good evening to our own Antipodean in Hobart, Tasmania, our daughter Rachel. Hi, Rachel. So, West Clare is infamous for the scale of evictions, poverty and mortality suffered by the destitute during the Great Irish Famine in the late 1840s. The failure of the Kilrush Poor Law Union Workhouse to cope with the influx of malnourished and emaciated paupers has been very well documented. So against this background of the famine in West Clare, my thesis examined the lives of 32 orphans from the Kilrush Workhouse, who were selected as participants in the Earl Grey Assisted Migration Scheme. So between 1848 and 1850, over 4,000 young women aged between 14 and 20 set sail from the workhouses of famine-ravaged Ireland. Next slide, please, Rachel. So by November 1847, there were over 6,000 eviction notices being served on the poor of Kilrush Union by opportunistic landlords. They were seeking to avoid responsibility for their impoverished tenants. So the evictions were traumatic, they were merciless, and the destitute and the starving made their way to Kilrush to seek refuge in the workhouse. With over 1,600 paupers in a workhouse built to house 800, the conditions were gruesome. Next slide, please, Rachel. So while Ireland was suffering the effects of the Great Famine, the Australian economy was doing very well and booming, and the authorities were crying out for servants and wives for the settlers, and it was hoped that an influx of female emigrants would help to tame the frontier and civilise its male population, where men outnumbered women by 7 to 1. Earl Grey was Secretary of the State for the Colonies, and he devised a scheme to send female orphans from the workhouses of Ireland to Australia. And in March 1848, each of the workhouse unions received a letter outlining details of the scheme, with very specific instructions for the selection of the orphans. Suitable applicants, they had to be between the ages of 14 and 18. They were to be single. They were to be of industrious habits and good character, whose education had been attended to. They were to be free of smallpox, and they also had to be resident in the workhouse for at least 1 year, and that was to ensure that young women did not try to enter the workhouse to avail of the opportunity to participate in the scheme. Now, while the union guardians were delighted and supported the scheme, and demand far exceeded the number of places available, the scheme was compared to white slavery by Irish nationalists who were vehemently against sending vulnerable young Irish women to Australia. Next slide, please. Rush Union Guardians, they were responsible for providing the orphans with a very detailed list of requisites and a safe passage to Plymouth. So the Commission's instructions to the workhouse guardians were meticulous. Each of the orphans was to have a painted and lockable wooden trunk that was 2 feet long by 14 inches wide and 14 inches deep. I think there's one of those in one of the museums in Australia, just one left. And the list of stipulated items was to be pasted on the inside of the trunk and the orphan's name stenciled in large letters on the outside. Each wooden trunk also contained a medical certificate stating that the orphan had passed a medical exam and had been vaccinated against smallpox. There was a reference from the workhouse attesting to the excellent behaviour and unblemished moral character. So the orphans travelled from Kilrush to Limerick by steamer on the 8th of January 1849 and then to Dublin by train, where they boarded a boat for Plymouth at the North Wall. And upon their arrival in Plymouth, Commission officers examined the orphans and their trunks to ensure the highest standards of cleanliness. A medical examiner was also on hand to ensure that there was no infections or contagious complaints and to certify that all of the orphans had been vaccinated. On January the 20th, the orphans boarded the SS Pemberton, and newspaper reports indicate that they had a fine, healthy appearance and seemed well pleased with their destination. The Kilrush orphans, who together with their other orphan companions from poor law unions in Rossgrey, Limerick, Nenagh, Tipperary, Lisnaskea, Mallow, the South Asylum in Dublin and the Cork Foundling Hospital, must have been relieved and excited to finally find themselves on board the ship that would take them to the other side of the world. Surgeons or doctors were appointed to each Earl Grey ship to supervise the daily routine of the orphans and to ensure the highest standards of behaviour, cleanliness and fare on board. And these surgeons were responsible for the moral tone of the ship. They were independent of the ship's officers and crew, and they closely supervised the daily routine and the organisation of the orphans. The orphans were up at 7 in the morning and they ate their breakfast at around 9. And after that, they scrubbed and they cleaned the berths, the tables, the lockers, and between the decks, and they tidied away their bedding ready for inspection. It was very regimented. Classes under the direction of the matron and her assistants began at around 11, and orphans were taught reading and writing and arithmetic, and they were also encouraged to attend to their knitting and needlework. And 2 mornings were designated for washing the laundry up on deck each week, so that everything was hung up to dry and could be tidied away before the evening. And every few weeks the trunks were brought up from the hold so that the contents could be checked, or so that the orphans could swap some items of clothing. This must have provided great excitement and distraction as the orphans rummaged through new possessions to make sure that everything was in order. And the surgeon superintendents were also instructed to encourage singing and dancing in the evening before bed amongst the orphans themselves. Now, there was no fraternisation with the sailors, that wasn't permitted. The unfamiliar rich diet provided to the orphans on board the Earl Grey ships caused them discomfort until they grew accustomed to the variety and cornucopia of food. And this novel experience of a balanced and healthy diet enabled many of the orphans to menstruate for the first time. Now, this must have been an alarming experience for these young motherless girls, but it is probable, and I like to think, that they found comfort and support amongst one another on their 3-month sea journey together. Next slide, please, Rachel. So when they arrived at Port Phillip, the orphans had to remain on board while there were more inspections, and the officials came on board, and then the priests heard their confessions. Advertisements in local newspapers and a red flag hoisted from the emigration depot informed the local community that these Irish orphan girls were for hire, and applications from suitable employers were invited. And the first of the Kilrush orphans to be hired was a 19-year-old laundress, Mary Kelly. The hiring continued over the next few weeks, and by the 16th of June, each of the orphans had left the depot to their new employment. The arrival of the Pemberton orphans appears to have met with the initial approval of the colonialists. However, amid rumours of wild behaviour and exaggerated scandals, not all of the settlers were happy with the influx of the Earl Grey orphans, and the scheme was discontinued in 1850 after only 2 years. And while the Kilrush orphans had all suffered the same deprivations and penury in famine-ridden Ireland, their colonial differences were very varied. The majority were married within 3 years to much older men, and many led very long and productive lives, enjoying much more opportunities than could have been possible had they remained in Kilrush Workhouse. Some, however, were exploited and abused by the men they encountered and endured great hardship and misfortune in Australia, some ending up in prison, others ending up in asylums. So, adopting a history of family approach, the research drew heavily on a wealth of archival material sourced from both Ireland and Australia. So there was an examination and analysis of birth, baptism, marriage, death and probate records from sources including Kilrush Board of Guardian minute books, government circulars and letters, ships' medical records, convict records, orphan databases, and Irish, British and Australian newspaper records, and that all provided a foundation for this investigation. So the Masters of History in UL gave me the skills and confidence to undertake this research, and I'm really looking forward to further exploration of the untold stories of the Earl Grey orphans. Thank you.
Rachel, you're muted there if you want to just unmute.
Sorry, thank
Perfect.
you.
There you go.
Thank you very much, Sharon. And I know that some people had tuned in specifically because they were very interested to hear about the Earl Grey research you've done. I know a lot of people in Australia obviously have an interest in that as a topic. So again, you might have some questions afterwards about more detail about your research. So we'll move now on, I think, to Carmel. Carmel is our final speaker, and she will be introducing us to Isabella Quin of Nenagh, County Tipperary. Carmel has been travelling to Ireland regularly over the past decade, researching her Irish ancestry, and it was on one of these trips that she committed to studying a certificate in the history of family and genealogical methods at Limerick, and from there she commenced the MA History of Family, which she felt was a natural progression to gain further knowledge and history about family structures, culture and the society within Ireland. So pre-COVID, she was working in creating and implementing recreational and wellbeing programs in aged care in Melbourne and teaching family history skills in the community sector. So I'm going to pass over to you now, Carmel. I'll just share the screen and then we're looking forward to your presentation. So I'll just do that now. Okay, thank you, Carmel.
Just a reminder, Carmel, just to unmute yourself as well, just before the presentation begins.
Yeah.
There you go, perfect.
Good. Okay, my name is Carmel McEvey and I completed the MA History of Family under Dr. Rachel Murphy's tutelage in 2019. As you have heard from both my fellow presenters, Kathy and Sharon, specific reasons for commencing study and research at this level are different, and they're individual and varied. In September 2018, as Rachel said, I graduated from UL, the University of Limerick, with the Certificate of History of Family and Genealogical Methods, which I had undertaken both while residing in Ireland and then online while back in Melbourne, Australia. I remained in Ireland and I commenced the Master of Arts, History of Family, and in total spent about 5 months in Ireland from September to December 2018, and then from February to April 2019, staying in Nenagh, Tipperary, which is one of my ancestral homelands. Originally, my wish to study in Ireland developed from the perceived need to have authenticity and accredited authority in Irish research as part of my genealogy and family history work. My research aim was to learn more about the historiography of Nenagh and its social and cultural mores, which would provide further understanding for my genealogical interests and study, which had been ongoing for many years. Searching every database I could find in Ireland provided no evidence of a primary source document from an individual from Nenagh that could offer enough breadth for critical analysis or a 20,000-word dissertation, which could then be supported with secondary source material. Dr. Murphy and Rachel casually found a reference Isabella Quin of Nenagh diary in the Wigan Archive database in Wigan, England, and the rest is history. Next slide, please, Rachel. On visiting the archive in Wigan in December 2018, I was given permission to capture over 400 photographs of Isabella's writing, which I transcribed in full. This diary is part of the Edward Hall collection. Edward Hall was a bookseller and a collector of mid-19th century women's writing, and in 1951 he donated over 200 journals and diaries to the archive. My research indicates that this specific diary is the only known surviving example of Isabella's writing, but it is possible that she wrote a diary during her entire lifetime. Isabella wrote this diary volume over a 46-month period from January 1866 until October 1869. Her diary is written in her own hand and it comprises of 66,131 words. And this slide shows the catalogue entry that's at the Wigan Archive in England. It's an interesting description of the diary. Having studied it minutely, I'm not sure that I would agree completely with the way it's described there. But it's certainly an interesting and unique document. Isabella Quin was born in 1838 and she was the only daughter of a notable doctor in Nenagh, Tipperary, Dr. O'Neill Quinn, and his wife, a Quaker and charity advocate, Harriet Harding. The family resided at Silverton in Silver Street, which is in the centre of town, and they were of upper middle class status. Isabella had 2 brothers, Charles and Henry, who both served with distinction in the British Army and were stationed in Nenagh, in India, and various English barracks, including Chatham and Kent. Isabella's private diary is a unique primary source document, both in terms of its rich narrative and its description of life in Nenagh and surrounds over 150 years ago. Her writings provide a rare window into her world, including upper middle class society and her linkages to landed elite families via her mother's ancestry. Her contribution provides a lens upon which to investigate and analyse the life of one Irish woman and her activities within her own private and public domain. I contextualise this micro-study, researching the social conventions of the time, examining the role of the middle-class woman within the private sphere of the home, and expectations related to domestic responsibility and hospitality. Isabella Quin conformed to this role as her mother was involved in philanthropic work. The taking of tea and welcoming soldiers and those of responsibility from the nearby barracks and the community functions and activities of the local Church of Ireland feature as public leisure interests that she was involved in. Her own personal domain pursuits including archery contests, reading literature from notable authors of the period, socialising with friends and family, developing close women-to-women relationships and craft work. Women of this class and era are underrepresented in academic research. My analysis of Isabella's narrative contributes to, and it also builds on existing scholarship of the role and responsibilities of women of this period. As I researched my topic, I drew on the critical analysis skills and scholarship I had been introduced to in the MA History of Family taught modules. As Rachel has mentioned, researchers such as Michael Anderson in Approaches to the History of the Western Family, 1500 to 1914, have identified different approaches to the history of family. My research took a sentiments approach to history of family, meaning that I analysed the diary to gain a more precise understanding of the emotions, relationships and themes within the diary, drawing on research by scholars such as Emma Morton and David Fitzpatrick, whose linguistic analysis of immigrant correspondence has contributed to our understanding of family relationships. I also drew on works by diary writing theorists like Philip Lejeune and the Irish historian Una Frawley, who's when designing my methodology in the process of recording personal writings. Works by historians Edward Shorter and Lawrence Stone further contributed to understanding of the established traditions and parameters of the development of family units within class structures. I also drew on additional primary source material such as the Nenagh Guardian newspaper, National Library of Ireland William Lawrence photographic collection, the National Archive of Ireland, land and deed records and vital records were relied on to fill in the story in detail. The diary contains no reference to Isabella's life or her family pre-1866, so I conducted research in genealogical databases and newspaper content to develop a fuller and more accurate picture about her past. And here's a slide here showing Isabella's handwriting of her diary and the format upon which she wrote her diary. It's quite interesting to see and to get a feel of the diary and read someone's writing. I also, of course, wanted to understand what happened to Isabella following her completion of her diary in 1869, so used these and many more resources to tell the story of the remainder of Isabella's life. My research identified a number of key events that complete her life history: leaving Nenagh in 1880, selling the contents of the family home, residing with her sister-in-law Kate in London, marrying her husband Faulkner Eyre in London in 1894, being left a widow after a 3-year marriage, dying in 1914 and being buried in Kent with her husband. So studying at UL, University of Limerick, both while residing in Ireland and then online, provided a fabulous opportunity to broaden my knowledge and interests. It opened my eyes to further technical research skills and methodologies and allowed me time to develop ideas and narrative concerning this very unique and interesting case study. I thoroughly enjoyed the experience and the support, the teaching and the time made available, and of course all the suggestions made by Drs. Rachel Murphy and Kira Brannick. I would recommend anyone looking at this course and particularly in its flexible teaching method to become involved and commit to the year-long study. For me, post-COVID, Isabella Quin provides me with a starting point to further study and with permission publish her diary. I view the MA History of Family as the foundation point upon which I can extend my knowledge and formal research of this historical time and geographical period. Thank you.
I'll just stop sharing the slides there. Thank you so much, Carmel. Again, another very different topic, but hopefully one that everyone else found very interesting. I'm sure there'll be questions for you as well. And I think one thing that I'm delighted about is that after having done the course, you can see that all 3 of our alumni have just decided to go on and build on their research, and they've developed so much as researchers in that year. So it's just lovely to see that you're continuing and doing fantastic things, as you go on. So I'm going to open the floor now to questions, and I think we have 10 minutes, but if there's more questions, we'll carry on answering the questions for a bit longer if there are any additional ones. I'm just going to have a quick look in the chat to see if there's anything there. So I'll just answer. Lisa has a question. I can't see Lisa there, but Lisa has a question. Can I undertake the course? I completed a certificate in family history and genealogical methods. That sounds fine. Obviously, you have to fill in an application, Lisa. What I will do in a minute is I'll actually put my email address into the chat. And if anyone wants to find out more or just has any questions, you can email me directly if you want. Essentially, the fees for the course, if you're in the EU, they are normally around, they have to be completely finalised, but they're normally around €6,000. And if you are an international student, they are somewhere around the €8,000, €9,000 mark. Obviously, that's converted from whatever currency you are dealing in there, okay? But what I would recommend is, if you are interested and do want to know the details of that, I'll put my email into the chat here and we can get the exact figure for you, okay? Let's scroll down a bit further. So we have questions for Sharon. I know you've been answering there, Sharon, already, but it might be useful for everyone. Ruth asks, are the Kilrush Workhouse records available online?
Now, the Clare County Library has amazing resources and records online. So even just to go in, you'll get lost in there. There's so much there. It's really, really interesting. And there's quite a lot there about Kilrush. But it's really lovely to go in to our local study centre. They're very helpful there and you can access the records. So I've left my email address if anybody is looking for anything in particular. I'm actually have a bit of free time now, so I'm quite happy to have an excuse to go in to spend some time there.
That's great. Thank you, Sharon. And then Aileen says, all three topics are fascinating. I'm looking forward to attending the course. How many hours a week were required to complete the dissertations? And then again, she says, thank you to the presenters. And she thought that the presentations were brilliant. So I might ask each of you in turn, because I think it very much depends. It can be as much or as little as you want to make it. So I'm going to hand over, maybe Sharon, as your mic is off, do you want to start off? And maybe just briefly, each of you?
Okay. Carmel and Kathy and I met for the first time yesterday, and it was interesting. They actually spent more time at the University of Limerick than I did. I'm half an hour down the road from the university and they're in Australia, but they actually got home to Ireland. So you can actually do it fully online. I was, at the time, I was working as a principal in a very busy school. So I was trying, and I'm on a farm, married to a farmer, so it was very busy time. It took up my year. But I was very happy to spend time, you know, they lit the fire for me every evening in the parlour. I think they were delighted that I was gone every evening, but it did take up that time, but I absolutely loved it. And it was the best thing I've done for myself in a very long time. I did it in the 1 year. Some people have opted to do the 2 years where they do the dissertation the second year. I found that doing it in the 1 year, while it was intense at the end with the thesis, you were completely immersed in it, and it was so interesting. It was just fascinating, and really interesting people on the course. So there is a time element if you want to do well in it and if you want to learn, but you can do it over the 2 years, so there isn't that pressure.
Okay, and maybe should we move on to Carmel now? Have you got anything to add to that, Carmel?
I'd agree with Sharon. It is fairly intense when you are writing the dissertation. I did a lot of research in Ireland because I knew I was coming back to Australia and I knew I was coming back to work at that time. So I did as much as I could while I was in Ireland, and had as much of a format and had as many discussions with Rachel while I was there. Although I also spoke to her, of course, online, and also attended the other lectures online when I was back in Australia. It is intense, and it is you know, you are looking for references, and I was going to the library here in Melbourne, the State Library. I was looking to get as much as I could, but of course I also had support all the time, backs and forwards to Rachel, virtually as needed. So I think it's achievable. Certainly I loved it. Yes, I felt it was a lot and it was an intense period, but would I do it again? Absolutely.
Thank you. And Kathy, do you want to add anything, Kathy?
Similar stories. As you mentioned earlier, I'm self-employed, and I took the brave decision to actually not work for the year that I was doing the course. So I did did it in my head as a full-time student, and I found doing the online subjects, the first and second semester, that took up not 8 hours a day every day, but probably on average about 3 to 4 days a week. I was doing some work on it because we had weekly assignments to do in 2 of the subjects. When it came to doing the dissertation, I had already done a body of work before I came to Ireland, but I came to Ireland for 5 months from the beginning of April, so I was able to attend a couple of classes and a seminar that we had in Limerick, and I mixed it with being at home and catching up with friends and family for the 5 months, and it got a little bit intense probably around June and July when I was writing things up and rewriting and etc. I was lucky to finish perhaps 2 weeks before the deadline, and I decided I did that and I submitted, and that left me with 2 weeks to just go around and say goodbye to everybody, because I think they'd got used to having me at home and didn't realise that I was going back. You know, it was the longest I'd ever spent in Ireland, but it meant that I had access to the Clare Studies Centre in Ennis, which is fabulous, access to newspapers, a lot of which are not online. So it just gave me an extra by going to Ireland, which, you know, there are some resources that are not available online yet for the dissertation that I chose to do. So yeah, so I was good to myself, and it was a lovely experience, but it got very intense, like the others said. Yeah.
That's great, actually. Thank you, Kathy. And in fact, you know, we're at that period now where I'm getting the first drafts all in for our current master's students. So you know, so they're at that point right now. I'm just scrolling down in case there's any other questions. Barbara Barclay, nice to see you there, is saying she was late joining but enjoyed hearing about the research. Wonderful to see the presentation. Siobhan says the same. Rihanna says, Rihanna's saying there's a recording available, so if anyone wants to listen to the recording, they can do.
Yeah, it'll actually be sent out to anybody who's attended the event.
Okay, perfect.
It'll be sent out straight. And just as well, Rachel, while you're there, Keith, I think that's how you pronounce it. He's after putting his hand up. Keith, if you want to ask your question.
Sorry, I'm so sorry.
You're all right.
Keith, if you want to unmute your microphone and
he's there. We can hear you. Keith, work away.
Yeah, hi. I can thank everyone for an absolutely fascinating presentation. I come as a technologist, and all I can say is this is one of the first times that I've used this technology, and I say thank goodness for technologists to facilitate presentations like this across the world is truly amazing. I come at it slightly differently. I'm retired. I'm 71. Had a friend that died through COVID. You probably realise that Britain's response to COVID was pretty poor, pretty shabby. I would love to go and study in Limerick, and I'm struggling to know, did the COVID experience impact on the way that you learned? And I suppose my fundamental question is, if you were doing it again, would you do it the same way that you actually carried out your studies?
Well, I suppose I was a COVID student because bang in the middle, COVID hit, but I was doing it mainly online because I was working full time as a school principal. So really, it didn't really impact. We didn't have our great hurrah day when we graduated, which was disappointing. But apart from that, not really, no.
No.
The local centre did close down for a number of weeks, so I didn't have access to those archives. But I'm smiling, you know, for those of you in Australia, most of the records I needed were in Australia. So if you're thinking of studying, you don't need to come to Ireland. It would be very nice to come to Ireland, but you can. There's so many records. Australia is amazing for what you have online, and I'm hoping someday to get back to Australia to actually do some more research, things that aren't online. So. Not really, no. I wouldn't have done anything differently.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I suppose, and Carmel and Kathy might have something further to say in a minute. One thing to say is, you know, because the course is taught in online and blended format, it means that people can do whatever they want to do. You know, just because you sign up as an online student doesn't mean you're not welcome to join us in the classroom when that becomes possible. Likewise, if you're a classroom student and you can't make it for whatever reason, you can always access everything online. So that kind of makes it quite flexible. This year, so none of the students, I'm teaching a cohort of students at the moment that have been fully online, and they're the first group that have only been teaching online, and some of them were a bit disappointed, the ones that wanted to be in the classroom, that they weren't able to. We had to be fully online all year. But I think, and again, it's for the students to say, we try to make it engaging enough that even if you can't meet in the classroom, which some people really like that aspect of things, that we try to make it as engaging as possible. And people have formed, long-term friendships, and, you go into reading groups in little groups and things like that. So the idea is to make it fun, and as well as, a learning experience, and to have this kind of community feel, and we were talking just yesterday about trying to organise a get-together of alumni, an online one, so that everyone from all corners of the world can get together. But I'll leave it there and just see if Carmel or Kathy would like to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think that's right. There certainly was a community feel. I mean, there was in my year, there was people from Australia, there was people from Ireland, there was people from England. You do have a community sense, and I have formed great relationships. For me, COVID didn't affect my year as such, because I finished in December 2019. So I didn't really have that effect as much as it possibly had, of course, for Sharon. But there were still other things that affected the year: traveling, being in 2 different countries, living in 2 different places, coming back to work, having to work when I was in Ireland, send back work to Australia. Lots of different things occurred. So you do have a lot of challenges, but you kind of overcome them step by step, and there's a lot of support, there's a lot of great friendship, and a really good community feel. So I've certainly made some great friends. So yeah.
Good.
Yeah,
thank you.
I'd echo what both Sharon and Carmel have said. Again, like Carmel, I was in Carmel's year, and so I wasn't affected by COVID as such, but I used the time last year when we were in lockdown here in Sydney to do that second project, which I had started as part of my research for the Masters, that the Griffith valuation, primary valuation transcription. And that used my time, because I felt when I came back, and particularly when we went into lockdown here, I wanted something to keep my brain going. And that was a really good adjunct, the fact I'd already started something. So I was very grateful to have had that. And as Carmel said, the friendships, the online friendships that you build up, and the collegiality of the course. It was lovely. I was in the great position of being able to go over and live with my brother, and back to where I was years ago in Clare, to have a little bit of the student experience. But it wouldn't have stopped me completing the course, I think, if we were in the current circumstances. And I'd say to you, go for it. I'm still debating about doing a PhD, and I'll be a good age when I'm finished it if I do it. So just go for it, because it was a great course, and it's had so many positives. I've just it's just been something I've wanted to do for a long time, and it was a wish fulfilled, and I'm really glad I did it.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Your enthusiasm is infectious. Absolutely.
Well, hopefully we might be seeing you, Keith, but drop a line if you want to.
Yeah.
You never know your misfortune.
And the other thing actually we do that some of the students, this year obviously didn't get to do was we do a couple of field trips every semester. So we'll go to one of the libraries or something like that for the people that are here, but we try to do alternative things for people that, are based overseas. So, we had people going and visiting their libraries or archives or museums, and telling the rest of the class about what's available, in Sydney or in, wherever they happen to be, New York or so on. And so we all learn from each other. I think everyone brings something to the discussion. So I'm just looking down the list there. There don't seem to be any other questions, but I mean, we're probably happy to do another maybe 5 minutes if there is any other questions that anyone has. So feel free to unmute the microphones or put your hand up. I would just say to the speakers, thank you again. There's a lot of really positive comments on your presentations here, you know, so well done, everyone.
Just myself, I now I know I'm here working, but Carmel, I actually live in Nenagh in Tipperary, and it was just really interesting to hear you speak from that perspective, because I was on Silver Street yesterday and it was just so strange for you to talk about it, because I grew up in Nenagh. I moved there when I was about 5 years old, and it's a town that has so much history in it, but that's a side of the history we never look into. A lot of the time there's a lot of medieval castles actually around the Nenagh area, and that's what we would have focused on in school. So hearing that side of it, because that you wouldn't really associate with the Midlands of Ireland, usually it'd be kind of west and east. So it was really interesting to hear that side of it. It just shows you, like, I've lived in this area and it's something I never even realised. So and another thing as well, I'm actually an undergrad student of UL, so I can't speak for a master's or PhD students, but I think for people who are going to be learning online, and especially with this course online and blended, it's great to know that because of the circumstances we've been in, the online learning has improved so much, and we've been forced to improve it. So it means that the experience you're getting, whether it be blended or fully online, has gone up a notch due to COVID, which is one of the positives that's definitely come out of it. And I found that with my own undergraduate course, is that even though we were online, the improvements have been made, that you're not losing out on engagement, and especially the social aspect of it, because I know a lot of people, when they go into this, it's another opportunity to, you know, broaden your horizons, meet new people. So that's definitely, if anybody has any worries about that, like, you can quash them. You'll definitely make friends, don't worry about that. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. That's really exciting, actually. I didn't know you came from Nenagh, Rena, so that's great.
There you go.
We'll have
It's a very small world.
There's so much history in Nenagh. We'll have to talk further.
Definitely.
I'd say if Carmel needs any more photographs of bits of Nenagh, she'll be emailing
I
you.
can walk into town. I can get it for you.
There's one more question just come in from Carol. Carol's asking, she was wondering if the thesis has to be based in Ireland. No, it doesn't. I mean, what we find is people that are interested in Irish history of one sort or another tend to be drawn to this particular course, although I have had people looking at things that, you know, are maybe slightly not so aligned with that. But for instance, last year I had a student that was based in America. Her family came over just at the tail end of the famine. They came over to America at that point. They migrated. And so her dissertation was actually looking at the journey. So looking at what their life was like in Ireland, you know, before and during the famine, the trip over, you know, the talking about the, you know, the coffin ships and so on, and then what happened to them afterwards. And it was really, really interesting to see. So it was really the story of the migrant from Ireland to America. I've had people do similar things, you know, with Australia as well. So what we often find is that people who have that story in their own family might want to use their own family as a case study. For instance, that's what this student did. Other people might focus on somewhere in the country that they are in, which Sharon made the good point. Obviously, if you're in Australia or if you're in America or wherever you happen to be, you will have those records more easily accessible, unless they're online. More and more records are online as well. So people will sometimes do an examination of maybe the Irish community in a particular town in America or something like that. It tends to be Irish related, I would say. I think that's really why people choose to come to Limerick to do it. But really, that, you know, I think, you know, whatever the topic is, we can probably accommodate it as long as there's some kind of link to family. We do the migration module, and I know that some students, you know, because you'll do a couple of essays throughout the course as well. So we had a student who had someone, because I remember someone from South Africa had signed up to the course. She was interested in our migration module to look further into some of her family that had migrated to South Africa. So for that essay, she did some research into migration there. So, you know, it's actually quite broad. And what I say to people in those first sort of, maybe the first half of the semester, just, you know, get interested in all the topics that we're talking about. And people normally find they're naturally drawn to a particular topic, and we can talk about it. And you have a lot of time to discuss your topic. Sharon, I think you were going to start on something, and then you discovered the Earl Grey Orphans, didn't you? Is that right?
Yeah, I was going to do something based on our farm at home, and just, it was actually going through I don't know where I found it, but Trevor McLaughlin's blog. So it was actually Australia that, and at the time, our oldest daughter is in Hobart, and we had 2 other daughters abroad. So we had 3 migrants. And in my research, there were 3 Kelly sisters who ended up living in the suburbs of Melbourne, who travelled over together on the Pemberton. So it kind of it just happened by accident. And I am ashamed to say I knew nothing about these Earl Grey girls. From the Irish side, I had never heard of them. We hadn't learned about them in history, and that's really why I'm so passionate about them, giving them a voice. Now, I know in other counties there has been more work done, but there was nothing in Clare, so it's just to give those young women a voice. But thank you, Australia, for that. That's where I got that.
And actually, I can see there, Carol, that you made the comment that you're Welsh and you haven't found any Irish ancestry yet. That's absolutely fine. So you could do something on, I mean, it doesn't have to be Welsh, it's totally up to you. But if you wanted to do something on Welsh history or the Welsh family, that would be absolutely fine. We actually have a couple of students that I that I know that have focused on Wales. There's one who actually did her master's, and she recently started doing her PhD with us in Limerick, and she is looking at mining communities. And so she'd started off looking at Wales, and now she's moving over to, I think it's Canada that she's looking at now. So really, you know, you could do whatever you want to do. So and I think it actually is very good from a sort of comparative perspective. People love hearing about other people's research, so you know, again, that would provoke a lot of discussion in the classes if you're focusing on Welsh history. So it's very broad, and it's really just applying the history of family techniques to whatever topic you decide to choose.
Rachel, I just see that Keith has his hand up there.
Oh,
just
Keith, yeah.
Before we finish up.
Okay, maybe we'll just take this question from you then, Keith. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Thank you. You really set me thinking. The first job that I ever did way back in the early 60s was to clean the car of Errol Flynn's parents. They came from Tasmania. He was a professor at Queen's, and telling me as a working class kid from Brighton that had absolutely no aspiration to go to university, that the Queen's University was the best in the world, you know, it flew straight over me. But it just occurs to me that would be a fascinating case study. You know, Errol Flynn's parents, it links Britain, it links Northern Ireland. So that's one to think about. But my question is, the certificate course hadn't occurred to me as a possibility. Could I do that through blended learning?
So in actual fact, some of the students here have done the certificate course. Would any of you like to sort of talk about that experience very briefly? I realise we're running over. Are you all right for the moment, Rihanna, if we carry on for a minute? Yep.
Is that the Certificate History of Family and Genealogical Methods?
Yes,
yes. Yeah, I did that with, and I'm not sure about Kathy or Sharon, but I did that with Dr. David Butler at UL. I was actually in Ireland again. I resided in Ireland as well as then residing in Australia, and doing it online. It was a blended format as well. And I thought that was really interesting and a really good foundation. And then I moved on to the Masters, of course. So yeah, I'd certainly recommend that as well. That was kind of like a stepping stone into UL, because I don't have an undergraduate degree. I kind of skipped that. So it was kind of like a, you know, a stepping stone to then going on to the Masters.
Good, thank you. Thank you, that's helpful.
So yeah, every year we do get students that have come from the certificate onto the Masters. It definitely, I mean, David Butler is a fantastic teacher. You know, for some people that are maybe a bit nervous about going straight into a Masters, I do agree with Carmel. You know, it can be a good bridge between the two. So you know, again, certainly drop a line and I can put you in touch with Dr. Butler if that's something that you're interested in as well. So, you know, it just really depends on personal preference. Some people are happy to go straight into the Masters. Other people just prefer to have that behind them and then to move on to it. So really personal preference, but he's a great teacher as well. So, you know, I think whichever you do, you'll enjoy it. And I think if you do his course, you'll probably decide you want to carry on and do the Masters afterwards anyway.
Good. My thanks to everyone. It's an amazing morning. Thank you.